Starburst.
Probably cherry.
Cherry. Okay, she named the fruit, not the color. Did you notice that?
I'm not the only one. Oh.
Okay, all right.
Mine's a strawberry, just so you know.
Okay, so she's going to pray for us.
Dear Lord, I just thank you for this day. I thank you for all the speakers that have spoke, Lord, and I pray for our next speaker that it'll be of God and not of him. And let's have a great rest of the day. In Jesus' name.
Amen. Okay. All right. So, I've taught church history in longer blocks before, and it's tough to fit everything into a short time span. So that's why I'm doing early church history, and I'm going to come back next week and talk to you guys about the Reformation. Yes. And so I picked out two of the most important parts of church history. So let's start off with this idea here. Do you guys raise your hands if you believe that we act based upon what we truly believe to be true? If you don't believe that, raise your hand. Okay. So we act based upon what we truly believe to be true. We're not always consistent with it, but we act based on that, right? And what we believe in the present is based entirely upon what we believe about history. Does that make sense? Does anyone disagree? It's totally cool if you do.
Wait, what did you say?
Okay. What we believe in the present is based entirely upon what we believe about history. Yeah? I'll give you an example. 2 plus 2 equals 4, right? How do you know that to be true? When did your teacher teach that to you? In kindergarten, in the past, right? So 2 plus 2 equals 4 is actually a historical statement. Do you act upon that statement that you learned that 2 plus 2 equals 4? Do you act upon it ever? If you go to the store across the street and you buy 2 items for $2 and they're non-taxable items, and you give the cashier a 10, you're expecting to get a certain amount back, right? If you don't get $6 back, something's going to happen, right? You are acting upon what you believe to be true from what you learned from history. Make sense?
Yes.
So, the Bible expects us to learn from history. In Joshua 4, when the Israelites came into the land after their wilderness journeys, they were instructed to build memorial stones, to stack these stones so that they would remember their history and they would learn from it. Make sense? Everybody with me? They remember that? Check this out. In Hebrews 11, we see what is called the Hall of Faith. And in this chapter, it's an amazing chapter, all these heroes of the faith are mentioned, and it mentions the amazing things that they did. And it doesn't mention every hero of the Old Testament, but a lot of them. And it'll say, by faith, Noah, and then the things he did. By faith, Abraham, and the things that he did, right? And then, you know that the chapter separations in the Bible are not necessarily inspired by God. So in chapter 12, verse 1, it connects with the idea that precedes it. And so in Hebrews 12:1, thinking of everything that the writer of Hebrews has just said about these heroes of the faith, it says, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd, some translations say a huge cloud, of witnesses to the life of faith, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up. And let us run with endurance the race God has set before us. So, since the writing of the book of Hebrews, it's been close to 2,000 years. So that cloud or that crowd of witnesses that the writer of Hebrews mentions in this verse, it's that much bigger, isn't it? Our cloud of witnesses includes great people like Polycarp and Athanasius. And our cloud of witnesses includes Martin Luther and John Wesley and all these amazing people. And so we can look at their examples as well as all of these amazing examples. And so to not learn from that, to me, seems like a huge waste. And I would say that the lack of understanding of church history is a real weakness within the church today. Because history keeps repeating itself. We can learn from their mistakes, and we can learn from their triumphs, and we can hopefully not make some of the mistakes that they made, and hopefully repeat some of their great revivals. And we also see that the same kind of heresies keep returning as well. There's so many great things that we can learn from it. I used it not too long ago. In our church, we've had an overseas mission vision for Guatemala. And there's a ministry we've been working with down there called Guatemala Deaf Ministries. And there's a real problem of illiteracy there. Not only do the people at times, they get adults even coming to their ministry that don't even know sign language, and they're deaf. They've never really had a conversation with anyone in their whole life. So first they have to teach them basic language, and then they have to teach them basics of doctrine once they've hopefully received the gospel. And I was talking with the leader of the ministry down there one day, and he was kind of frustrated because he seems like he's going over and over the same basic stuff. And he's like, I can't, these people barely know how to read. Some of them have just learned to sign that not that long ago. How do I reinforce into them basic doctrine about our faith? And so I said, the church has been through this before. People might not always like it or want to go back to this kind of thing, but in the past, the church used things like the church calendar as a way to reinforce issues within the faith. Now, unfortunately, it oftentimes turned into ceremonious kind of religion, but Christmas time is a perfect time to reinforce the idea of the incarnation of God. That God came and lived in human form and walked amongst us. That's a major doctrine, isn't it? That's a major thing and a major understanding, a basis for our foundation as a faith, isn't it? That talks about the character of who God is. Well, what did the church do in the early church? With people that basically didn't know how to read and write, they would teach them through holidays and feasts and things like that. So every Christmas was an opportunity to reinforce those things. When you get to Resurrection Sunday or Good Friday, there you can talk about the victory over death. You can talk about Christ returning as well. You can talk about his vicarious death on the cross, that he died in payment for our sins. At Pentecost, there's a great time to talk about the church, right? And so there you see that the church has been through problems of illiteracy before and ways that they dealt with it. They also used creeds in the early church. Now, a lot of people don't like creeds. They avoid creeds, and I can understand that at times. But you guys know what a creed is? No? It's like it's a statement that you're making. In the early church, they had things like the Apostles' Creed was developed, and the Nicene Creed was developed. And it's basically you're stating the basics of your faith. Now, sometimes we don't like it because it can become ceremonious. It can almost seem like a vain repetition of a prayer. Does that make sense? If you're saying your prayer is just like you're repeating a bunch of words, like I've lived in Latin America before where sometimes, they're saying the rosary and it's like, okay, I'm going to say it in English though, but our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be, and then they go to the next bead, our Father who art in heaven, as if they're gaining something by each bead that they say a prayer for. And so in that aspect, it's become ceremonious, religious, and they're not even thinking about what they're doing. But a creed can often be a short statement about what our faith is, can be a good thing. And the early church had those, and they were often put into the New Testament. Did you guys know there's creeds in the New Testament? Philippians 2, 6 through 11. Deuteronomy 6, 4. 1 Timothy 3, 16. I'll read this one. And without controversy, great is the mystery of godliness. God was manifested in the flesh, justified in the spirit, seen by angels, preached among the Gentiles, believed on in the world, received up in glory. 1 Timothy 1:15. This is a faithful saying and worthy of all acceptance, that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am chief. See, when he says this is a faithful saying, he's saying something that people are often repeating. We have sayings in our culture, don't we? Things that are idioms, things that we say all the time, you know? And so those kinds of things can be helpful as well. And so we can learn from church history. All right, I've beat that horse to death. Let's move on. So we're going to talk first, as far as the times of history, we're going to talk about the apostolic age. So when I say the apostolic age, I'm talking about the time where apostles were still around. And typically this is from the time of Jesus' resurrection and ascension until about 100 AD. Here we see, and if we look at church history there, we see that the gospel is now spreading throughout the Roman Empire and beyond. There's an important aspect to the culture that's allowing it to spread really quickly too. It's a concept called Pax Romana. You guys ever heard of Pax Romana before? What does Pax Romana mean? Someone raise your hand. Hachu. What? I knew you'd know it. The peace of Rome, right? The Roman peace. Okay? And the idea behind that is that because Rome so dominated, there wasn't a lot of war. Because you couldn't war against the Romans because you'd get your butt kicked, right? So the people generally, overall, there was a peace that existed throughout the empire. And so that allowed a sort of a climate in which the gospel could easily move from one area to another. Plus, Roman roads were better than, it took hundreds and hundreds of years before the road system in Europe and around the Mediterranean was as good as it had been under the Roman Empire. And so the Roman roads and the commerce and peaceful trade that was moving also aided the gospel in moving around the Roman Empire. At this time, Christianity is still very Jewish. Most Christians are of Jewish heritage. Most opposition to the gospel at that time is from Jews. Most Roman persecution was actually at the request of the Jews. The Romans generally didn't have a problem with Christians. They thought they were weird, but they didn't really have a problem with it. Jews had been given an exception to a requirement under Roman law of acknowledging the Roman Emperor Caesar as a god. And they did not want this exception to be extended to Christians. And so that's a way that they persecuted the Christians by saying, they're not of us. They're not part of us. So don't give them this exception. And so they were often the ones going to the Roman authorities to talk bad about the Christians. And then in the 90s AD, so this is about 60 years or so after the resurrection of Jesus, we see that the last books of the Bible are written, writings of the Apostle John. And there's an important thing that we see in here. If you look at all of the books of John, all three of his epistles, you look at the Revelation, and you look at the Gospel of John, there's a flavor to them, there's a theme in them that is common, and it speaks to us today about what was going on at the time that John wrote them. Can anybody give me an idea of what that would be? Does anybody know that? You get a starburst. What was the question? In all the writings of the Apostle John, we see a theme throughout all of them that tells us about what was going on in the day that they were written. So there's a theme behind them. Okay, who raised their hand first? All right, somebody just... Prophecy? No? Antichrist? Well, he's mentioned. That's the only place where the word Antichrist is mentioned. No.
Persecution?
No. No. He does talk a lot about it, but the deity of Christ. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Nice throw.
You have an insurance form, right? So if I take out an eye, we're good? All right. The deity of Christ. So the reason why that's important to us is we understand that that's the kind of attack that was now coming. First, the attacks were external by the Jews, and now the attacks begin to be internal from false doctrine that's coming in. So we see that that's a motivation for John writing all of his books. It leads us to believe that there were probably by that time not only those attacks, but also infiltration probably from Gnostic thought. Okay, Gnostic. The first major internal fight is over the person of who Jesus is. And that idea is Gnosticism. Have you guys looked at Gnosticism yet in any of these classes? No. All right. Okay, I have bad handwriting, I admit it. Does anybody know what Gnosticism is?
Agnostics?
Agnostics is actually, comes from the same root words, but if you add an A to it, then what does A do? It's a negative. So an A is a negative. It's around this root right here. In the original Greek language,
Doesn't it mean not, agnostic is not knowing?
is not knowing. So it comes from the word for gnosko, which is knowledge. Okay? So an agnostic says that you cannot know. You cannot know if there's a God. Right? Or they don't know that there's a God. So Gnosticism, what that is the belief that there's some kind of a hidden knowledge in order to get saved. There's this mystery. Okay? And so they believe that you can attain to this knowledge through a bunch of different ways. All right? This is the first major heresy that was being fought. And Gnosticism lasted centuries in that area. Okay? And it has a resurgence today. You guys have heard of Da Vinci Code? And Dan Brown and those books and all of that nonsense? That's basically Gnosticism that's resurged. You guys ever heard of the Gospel of Thomas? Have you heard of that? That is an early Gnostic book. It wasn't written by the Apostle Thomas, but it's a Gnostic book. And what they believed, it's hard to pin them down because there are a bunch of different areas of Gnosticism and a lot of different ways that they thought. But generally, they believe that you could attain to this knowledge through good works or by fasting and starving your flesh. They believed that the world existed of material and spiritual, and that basically everything material was evil. All evil emanates from what's material. Everything that's spiritual is good. And so if you starve your flesh, you're starving evil. Does that make sense? So they were also, a lot of them were ascetics. You guys know what ascetics are? Monks. They're like monks. They'd hide away from the world, hide in a cave somewhere. And so they're denying their flesh. And then some of them actually believed that the best way to deny your flesh was to entirely give yourself over to your flesh. And those were called Epicureans. So the Epicureans were into like heavy parties and at times orgies and weird, gross stuff like that. And so they believe that you can attain to a higher knowledge in order to be saved. Okay? And this is very clearly denied by the writings of John that show Jesus as being God himself. All right? What they believed, part of what they believed is that Jesus, the ones that infiltrated the church believed that Jesus was the first creation, and then he created everything else. So they believed what he was, they called him a demiurge. I won't expect you to remember that. But they think that he was created first, then everything else was created by him. All right? But that he was not actually God. Okay? They had a lot of really weird stuff too. If you look in the Gospel of Thomas, they also they had statements like, you have to become a man in order to be saved. Have you guys heard of this Gospel of Thomas? See, the Greek thought of that day also believed that the male form was good and the female form was bad. Greek culture was kind of like that, all right? The guys like their guys, okay? And so and so they believed that if you drew close to Jesus, that Jesus could change a woman into a man, and that way that woman could get saved. So that's one of the, yes, sir.
Those were the Gnostics, or were they specifically the Epicureans?
No. There were so many different forms of Gnosticism that we don't know for sure what the group that left the Gospel of Thomas behind and what group they belonged to. Yes, sir.
In Revelation, when it mentions the Nicolaitans, are those also Gnostics?
We don't know necessarily. There's different thoughts on it. Some think that's the Nicolaitans are those that were forming a priesthood, sort of a laity that's special and different. Whereas what does Peter tell us about the priesthood? We all are priests, right? So some think that's what the Nicolaitans thought. Some think that the Nicolaitans were basically rebellious against church leadership. His question? About the Nicolaitans, if they were basically Gnostics. We don't know for sure. Okay? So Gnosticism, and when you think about God's nature with an idea like Gnosticism, think about this. If you have to attain this higher knowledge in order to get saved, doesn't that go against the very nature of our God? The thing I love about God is that the simplest of person, that the little child can come to know him. And we're told that we have to have a childlike faith, right? We have to come to him as a child. And anybody ever done VBS before? I love VBS and you're talking to little kids that are like 4 or 5 years old. Pretty much you tell a 4-year-old the gospel and they're like, yeah. Right? It doesn't take an Albert Einstein intellect to understand the gospel. And under Gnosticism, anyone born with Down syndrome, they're going to hell. If they believe in hell. Yeah, how is someone with the most simple of minds going to be able to understand this higher knowledge that you have to attain to in order to get saved? So it maligns the character of God, doesn't it? Don't we have a God that loves everybody and wants all to come to the... Right? Okay. Okay, let's see here. So that's the apostolic age. We're going to move into the post-apostolic age, the 2nd century here. Most writings from the early church fathers deal with different kinds of heresies that were coming up, okay? And if you're a nerd like me, you'll actually enjoy reading some of this stuff. But it can get pretty dry at times. But there were a bunch of different views of Jesus that arose during the 2nd century. There was the idea of Ebionism and Docetism, Apollinarianism, Eutychianism, Montanism. Docetism is the view that Jesus is God, but he's not human. Ebionism is the view that Jesus was fully human, but not divine. There was a movement of Jews, Jewish Christians, up until the 3rd century that were Ebionists. And they rejected all of Paul's teaching. Not surprising that they would reject Paul, right? And they had accepted Jesus as being the Messiah, but not that he was God. Another early heresy was called Nestorianism. It held that Jesus had two natures, human and divine, that were completely separate. And so you got all of these different views that are rising that have to be refuted. And so the early church fathers spent a lot of time and a lot of parchment and a lot of papyrus writing about these different things that are popping up that they have to refute. And so I'm very thankful for those guys that did that at that time, in a time when it was very difficult to do that kind of thing. To buy a parchment was a huge cost. Then to write that down, then to have things copied and sent to different parts of the empire to make sure that people knew about it. I'm going to address another one of these heresies. It's called Montanism. And as we look at these, we can see that there are parallels today with these things, right? Montanism is named after this guy named Montanus. It's not Joe Montanus, but Montanus. You younger people don't even understand that at all. Football fans might, right? Yeah. Niners. Yeah. I'm a Charger fan, but it's all right. So Montanus became a convert. Montanus became a convert to Christianity around 170 AD, and he lived in Asia Minor, which today would be? Turkey. Okay, who said Turkey? All right. All right. Oh, Aaron wants another one? All right. All right, all right. So, he was part of this cult in Turkey to the goddess Cybele. He claimed that he had the gift of prophecy, and he became a Christian, and he would prophesy in an ecstatic state. And Eusebius, who was a church historian who lived in the 4th century, he wrote the following about this guy Montanus. It says, in his lust for leadership, he became obsessed and would suddenly fall into frenzy and convulsions. He began to be ecstatic and speak and talk strangely and prophesied contrary to that which was the custom from the beginning of the church. Those who heard him were convinced that he was possessed. They rebuked him and forbade him to speak. And so this guy gathered quite a following around him, and he had these two women that were his prophetesses, and they would go into a frenzy, and then they would start speaking strangely. And he would say that what he is saying is actually adding to Scripture. And so we see that there can be parallels with that today, right? So where would we draw a parallel with something like that today? With Mormonism? Okay, that they have prophets, right? That are not examined. Whatever they say goes.
Like the new books they're making.
Okay. A lot of the televangelists. And is there any... Now, is prophecy okay? They didn't have a problem with the fact that there was prophecy going on. They had a problem with the form in which it was presented. Right? So that's like the modern televangelist. Right? What does the Bible tell us? That we need to examine all of these things and keep or retain that which is good. Right? Often there's no examination of these prophetic utterances that happen. And so that was happening in that day. We can learn from the example of the early church, right? Here's another one, Arianism, and we'll come back around to him a little bit later too, but Arius was a teacher in the early 4th century AD. He was one of the earliest and probably the most important item of debate among early Christians on the subject of Christ's deity. He said that Jesus was firstborn, much like the Gnostics did, that he was firstborn, and then he created all of the rest of creation. Okay? So he questioned whether Jesus was God. All right? There was a major division at one point in the church over this guy, Arius. And there's even a couple of sects today, one in particular, that look to him as being a guy who was like the only one who was right on back in that day. So who would we compare this guy to? Firstborn of creation. You guys just dealt with cults last, right? Rick Mosa was talking about cults, right? With Mormons and even more so, Jehovah's Witnesses. Jehovah's Witnesses looked to this guy Arius as if he was right on back in that day. And so we see that the same mistakes are repeated over and over again. Let me see here. All right. So by this time, in the early 2nd century, we have, even though there isn't a canon of the Bible that is all recognized and accepted, generally speaking, the churches are all recognizing the same books. There's a few exceptions here and there. Do you guys know what I mean by canon? What do I mean by canon? That there's the 66 books of the Bible, right? Does anyone know what canon means?
That it's true.
That it's true? No. I'm going to get you guys on this one. Nobody gets a starburst. No.
Like, sort of like canon, like what God, yeah, like what the person who made, like the situation is told is true. Like
That's what it means in application, and I'll give you a starburst for that. But it's not literally what the word canon means. Anyone else?
Gun type thing that shoots big metal balls.
Somebody wants a starburst, so I'll just go ahead. Thanks.
Yeah.
All right. No, it doesn't. But thank you. Someone else over there? A what? No. 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 I can't believe no one has done like a Bing search or something. All right.
Cannons where something would start out and things would just grow off of it.
No. No. Okay, you guys done yet? Measured. All right. You definitely get one. A measuring stick? What did they use as measuring sticks back then? Okay. Who was first? Okay.
She's right here.
it was used as a plumb line.
Okay.
They would base everything off of and how they would be able to tell if the scriptures.
Well, I like the construction reference there, but it's a reed. A reed. You guys know what a reed is?
Yeah.
So a reed is what they would use to measure things. So canon, the word canon comes from the word for reed. All right? And so if it measures up, then it's considered authoritative. Okay? Now by this time we have different church fathers that are recognizing, they all have different lists of books that they accept and books that they don't. All right? One of the big problems that people have with our Bible today is the way that it came together. And so a lot of times there's critiques from atheists or even very liberal Christianity dealing with it. But the fact is that the early church fathers quoted from all of the books that we recognize today, to the point where like 92% of the New Testament that we have is quoted in the early church fathers. And there's a bunch of books that they had reason for doubting or for rejecting. One of the books that almost made it in is a book called the Didache, which was a list of rules. It's like a book of rules. But one of the reasons that they didn't accept it was because they didn't know who the author had been. They weren't sure of its origin. All right? So one of the questions that would come up is, well, where did this book come from? Who wrote it? As a result, Hebrews almost did not make it into our canon. Now, I believe that there was God's sovereignty involved in this process, and that he kept together the Bible that he wanted, but that's not exactly an answer that an atheist wants to hear. Okay? You can say, well, Richard Dawkins, darn it, God was sovereign as he put that Bible together. He's going to say, well, I'm not going to accept that, right? So it's good to have other reasons for why they accepted which books and which books they didn't. A lot of what's called apocryphal books or New Testament apocrypha are books that we don't know if the person that it says on the name is actually the person. There's an epistle of Barnabas that we're not sure necessarily if that was Barnabas or not. So, but by this time, most of the early church fathers' lists of the books they accepted were pretty much the same. Okay? Does that make sense? All right. And so that's important to know. And so we see then that there's early church fathers that are constantly fighting for the faith. And some of the names I'll just throw out there, but Ignatius of Antioch, he lived until 107 AD. Irenaeus lived from 120 until 200 AD. He's an interesting guy to look up. Justin Martyr lived from about 100 to 165. Polycarp, 69 to 155. He's another very interesting guy. Polycarp was the bishop in Smyrna. And it's possible, many historians think, that in the book of Revelation, the 7 letters that are written to the 7 angels of the churches, that one of the interpretations is that those angels are actually the people that are the heads over those churches. And so the angel of the church of Smyrna would actually have been the bishop of that church. And so it's possible that that's Polycarp who he's writing to. Polycarp, as an interesting story, kind of letting you know about kind of what's going on between the leaving the Jewish heritage behind and becoming more and more of a Gentile church in that age. There was a little bit of a division between Rome and the Eastern Church over what day that they would celebrate the resurrection. The Roman Church had begun to celebrate the resurrection together with like other Roman festivals. And so they recognized a different calendar. And Polycarp was very adamant that they should continue to follow the Jewish Passover and coordinate it with the Jewish Passover. And so he actually traveled to Rome to attempt to convince the Romans to continue to observe the way that the church originally did, right? And they had this argument, and I guess it was a very peaceful argument that they had. And at the end of the day, they said, no, Polycarp, we're going to do it our way. And he said, okay. And then they agreed to disagree agreeably, and Polycarp went home. And that's the end of the story. And I think that's actually a really cool story, don't you guys? As you're falling asleep. It's a cool story that these guys came to an agreement to disagree agreeably over something that was not that big of a deal. Cool? Then we have people like Clement, who lived from 30 to 100, Tertullian from 160 to 235. And now Tertullian, probably the big thing that we might want to remember about him is a statement that he made, probably his most famous statement, is that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. As we look at the early church history period, there's a bunch of different times where Christians are being martyred, where Christians are being burned at the stake. Polycarp ended up being burned at the stake. Justin Martyr, obviously his name Martyr, he was martyred. Ignatius was martyred. A lot of these guys were martyred. And so that idea that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, if you look throughout this time, you see that every time that there's a major persecution going on, you see that God pours out his Spirit in such a way that it counteracts it plus. You see conversions. Have you guys ever heard of the book Fox's Book of Martyrs? Have any of you guys ever read it? Yeah? You've read Fox's Book of Martyrs? All right, here we go. Almost hit her. He saved your life. You should thank him. So I was raised in the church, but for a long time I lived my life for myself. And then about 1999, I really, God grabbed a hold of me and started to do something different in me, right? And that's where I just had a passion for the Word and everything. And there were two books that I read that really just changed everything for me, other than the Bible. But the first one was this book called Jesus Freaks. You guys ever heard of that? So there was a band, it's from the same thing. So DC Talk, together with Voice of the Martyrs Ministry, they came out with this book called Jesus Freaks. And DC Talk, that's an old band, old Christian rockers. And it's all these stories about Christians, and it goes from the early church through to modern martyrs and things that examples of patience in the midst of persecution. And it just rocked my world seeing these examples of Christians that were just dealing with persecution like that, and the way that God turned those things into miracles. And I so loved that book, Jesus Freaks, that I had to get Fox's Book of Martyrs. And I got a particular version that continued after the original writings. It was updated for modern history as well. And I would highly recommend that every Christian read Fox's Book of Martyrs. And you see that so often as people are being executed, sometimes even their executioners get saved and then choose to die right then and there rather than deny Jesus Christ. Think about that. You're the one who's supposed to put this Christian to death, and then you see this person loving you, the one who's going to kill them, and the way that turns this rock-solid heart, and it just melts it, and it makes the person realize this person's God is real. I've been worshiping gods and never gotten an answer. I've been worshiping these gods and never really known any truth. But nothing is truer than this person is able to so live what they believe that they're going to death right now. I'm supposed to chop off their head, and they're loving me as I do it. And there's story after story of these people that just fell to Jesus Christ right there. And it's such an amazing thing that in the early church we see that. Now, what would be a parallel for us today? You guys know that today, yes, sir. Christians in the Middle East. There's story after story coming from the 1040 window. I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but the 1040 window is the latitude and longitude lines of that whole area that is the least reached area with the gospel. And there's so many stories coming out of there of the way that the Christians' persecution is being turned around, and God is saving the very persecutors. And it's amazing. I was watching this video of Egyptians, and they're Coptic Egyptians in this worship service, and it's after a bunch of their people had been beheaded by ISIS on the beach, and you see these guys. Have you guys ever seen Coptic priests? What they look like?
Yeah.
They're kind of funky looking, aren't they? They wear these long black robes. They got these big black hats that are like this, They got the big old crucifix kind of thing, And so you wouldn't expect them to be singing the kind of worship that, everything in it, you'd think that they were worshiping the way that we do, and raising their hands and just tears of joy, just crying out to Jesus. And it's so amazing the way that God pours out his Spirit. And so if ISIS, if the jihadists, if all of them were students of history, they would realize that what they're doing is totally the wrong thing to do. You want to get a church to be conquered? You want to conquer a church? Give them everything they want. You want to conquer a church? Make them lazy. You want to conquer a church? Give them affluence. And they'll drop their faith. But in the face of persecution, you see constantly in the early church the way that God pours out his Spirit as a result of these kinds of persecutions. Okay, enough of that sermon. So we see that there's this constant fight against different kinds of heresies and different beliefs of who Jesus is, and a staying true to the belief that Jesus is God and man, and so that's going on. And then at the end of the 3rd century, the start of the 4th century, the end of the 2nd century, the start of the 3rd century, we see that a little bit different thought kind of comes in that shakes things up a little bit. And so a guy comes on the scene, and he is in charge of the Christian school in Alexandria, all right? And his name is Origen. And it's important that we know this because it helps us to understand interpretation of Scripture. So up until that time, the accepted way of interpreting Scripture was using literal interpretations, okay? Now, sure, the Bible has interpretations that are figurative. You know what I mean by figurative? Symbolic things, right? Jesus says, I am the door. That doesn't mean he has hinges and a handle here, and you're like, okay, open up, Jesus, There's figurative language, right? But there's a lot of Scripture that, if the Scripture says something and it can be interpreted literally to mean what it says, and it says what it means, then the idea up until this time was always, well, then that's what it means. If you are able to interpret things literally, then interpret them literally. And so this guy Origen comes along, and he's in an area in which there was a lot of Gnostic thought, and he actually was I believe he was a convert from, I think it was Manichaeism, but anyways, he finds himself rising in the ranks at the Alexandrian school. Now, at the time, there were 2 main schools throughout Christendom that people looked to as being the centers of learning. All right? At that time, there was the Antiochian school. You guys have heard of Antioch of Syria, maybe? In the book of Acts, Antioch plays a key role there. And then Alexandria in Egypt. Okay? So, Origen becomes the head of this school, and he starts to think about, some of these scriptures that talk about the return of Christ. And he's thinking, well, you know what? He keeps saying that he's returning soon. And now we're about 300 years out, and there's no Jesus. So what does all this mean? And so he starts to create a systematic theology in which eschatology, you guys know what eschatology is? Study of the last days. So prophecy, prophetic fulfillment, those kinds of things. He starts to interpret especially those things in an allegorical way. That means in a symbolic way. So like in the book of Revelation, when it says that there's going to be 100-pound hailstone, he's saying, oh, that just is talking about just heavy problems, right? Or if it's talking about creatures with, tails like scorpions and stuff like that. A lot of that, of course, sure, that could be figurative. But he starts to interpret it in a way in which a lot of it is figurative and allegorical. Up until that time, everyone who had written about the return of Christ had an interpretation of prophecy as Christ returning before a millennial reign. Have you heard of the term premillennialism? Yeah? And so the complete consensus of the church up until that time was that Jesus would come before his millennial reign, and he would set up his throne literally, and that he would reign from earth. Okay? Probably the one who wrote the clearest about it was Irenaeus. Irenaeus had been a disciple of Polycarp. Polycarp was a disciple of John, the one who had the revelation. So someone who's in a direct line to the guy who had the revelation, you would think would probably have a pretty clear understanding of how that stuff is supposed to go down, right? Irenaeus is very clear about that and definitely believes that there is a tribulation time that's coming, and it was a literal tribulation time that there was. He actually believed in a 7,000-year history of the earth, and he believed that seventh-day rest equaled the like a Sabbath, and that would be that millennial reign of Jesus, when Jesus is going to reign on the earth. So then Origen comes along, and he starts to interpret it, and he creates he kind of founds what would today be considered an amillennial view. And he starts to say, well, maybe Jesus is already reigning. Maybe Jesus is already reigning from heaven. And that where it talks about him sitting on David's throne and about all of that kind of fulfillment, maybe that's happening in an allegorical sense, but it's from heaven. So that's kind of where that all comes from. Now, one of the things that happens, and you may even hear it during Bible boot camp, is you may hear people talking about like the pre-tribulational rapture is all a new invention, and that guys in the 1800s invented it, and so because it's new, you shouldn't believe it. Has anyone ever heard that before? No? Yeah, you guys have? So follow that logic. If you follow that logic that the belief in a pre-trib rapture is new and therefore it's not true, then also you have to reject amillennialism, because it didn't exist in the early church either, did it? Right? So the same people that push the idea that a pre-trib rapture isn't true because John Darby and Schofield invented it in the 1800s, supposedly, if you follow their same thinking, they have to throw out a bunch of their thinking, don't they? Does that make sense? So I'm telling you this so that you know that the early church all believed in a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ. Okay? You can make of it as you will. All right. So we have just enough time to talk about Constantine. So things are going on until this guy, Flavius Valerius Aurelius Constantinus Augustus. Yeah, that's a mouthful, isn't it? So Constantine had been the ruler of the west of the Roman Empire. All right? You guys heard of Constantine before?
Yeah, I've heard of it.
You saw a TV show, right? So Constantine was the ruler of the western part of the empire, and these other guys were kind of vying for power with him in the east. And so he was visited by a dream. There's different versions of the story, by the way, but some say it was a dream, some said it was during the day he had a vision, that the night before his battle, he was advised to mark the heavenly sign of God on the shields of his soldiers, and that he's given this symbol of an X with its head bent around. And he marked Christ on their shields. And then later on in his reign, he had this same symbol put on coins. And so this is the symbol. It's the Greek chi and rho. You guys ever seen that symbol?
Yes.
And so in Greek, the first two letters for the word for Jesus Christ, for Christ, is chi and rho. So this makes kind of a hard C sound, like a K sound, the X does. And then what looks like a P is a rho, which is the R sound, okay? And so it's the first two letters for Christ. And so when you see that, a lot of times in like Catholic churches or Anglican churches or churches like that, they'll have those symbols. You guys ever seen that? Yeah? So when you see that, don't be freaked out like it's Illuminati or something like that. That's what it stands for. Okay? And so he sees this and he says, conquer, and the voice says, conquer under this sign. And so he has his soldiers put that on their shields, and they win the day, and he becomes the emperor of the whole Roman Empire. He then moves the capital of the empire to what today would be Istanbul. That should have been a question for a Starburst, huh? Istanbul. Yeah, you got it, dude.
Istanbul.
Okay, Istanbul. Yes. Istanbul. Okay, all right. One more. All right, that's good. All right, stop. Okay. So the church goes through a huge change at this point. Up until this point, even though at this point they're not being persecuted that much, only a couple of emperors before had the worst persecution. So it hadn't been that long since they had been heavily persecuted by Diocletian, right? And so the Christian church goes from being heavily persecuted to now, immediately after winning his battle, Constantine asks for the church leaders to be brought to him, and he brings them up and he makes them magistrates and governors. He turns them into the power brokers of the empire. Imagine the drastic change that makes for the empire, right? And that adds to that interpretation of an allegorical interpretation. Because now they're thinking, hey, Jesus is reigning, we're winning. We now are ruling the Roman Empire, right? So Jesus brought this about, and they see this as entirely a good thing. And so with this, the prior interpretation of premillennialism starts to be called Chiliasm, and it's actually considered later a heresy in which some people in the church were killing those that believed in it. Chiliasm, because in Greek the word for 1,000 is kili, like a kilogram, kilometer. Get it? All right. You guys ever heard of Augustine? Or Augustine? He persecuted Chilias, had them killed, because they believed in a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ. Think about that. Not a very good testimony, is it? All right. So, with this, think about the amazing, the drastic changes that would have happened with the church now being the power brokers, right? What happened in the result is that you had all kinds of people that weren't real Christians wanting to be Christians. Imagine you're Mr. Merchant in Rome or Corinth or who knows what part of the Roman Empire in that day, and you want to be good with all the power guys, right? You want to have favor of the government. So what are you going to do? You're going to give them free stuff. You're also going to say you're a Christian, aren't you? Right? Even if your heart hasn't changed. So suddenly the church expands in a huge way as far as the number of people that are in the church, but the number of true Christians within the church drops, right? As far as percentage-wise. So now the church becomes less pure. There's an aspect about persecution that it purifies the church. Because if there's a chance you're going to be killed for your faith, what is it going to do? It's going to weed out the true believers from the non-believers, isn't it? Now you don't have that effect. Here's another thing, is that you've got people that are worshiping idols that still want to worship their same gods. So what do you do if your God is, okay, you're a merchant and you've got these ships. If you have ships on the ocean, on the sea, what God are you definitely giving sacrifices to? Poseidon, Neptune, right? Hey, that's worth a starburst right there. I don't know, but that's a false god. I don't know. Okay, all right. You see? So you still want to worship those things. Your heart hasn't changed. And so I've got these examples here that are actually pre-Christian art, and they're idols Because one of the common cults in that day was worshiping Madonna and Child. And I'm going to pass these around so you can see. Not Madonna the singer. I just kind of pass those around. All right. So here we have Osiris. Both of these here are Osiris and Horus. And so you see there's this cult to a mother feeding her child. Does it look common? Similar to something we see today? And notice in the one, she's wearing a crown. She's considered the Queen of Heaven, a title that is still used today by a particular group, right? Down here is a Roman version of that same thing in a fresco. And then here you've got some other ones that are Greek. We've got worship of this goddess and her child who's breastfeeding her baby. So if you were an archaeologist and you dig up this thing right here, maybe not so much the Egyptian ones, but if you dug up this one here, you might think, oh, that's Mary and Jesus, right? But it's not. These are actually pre-Christianity. So the whole flavor of the church changed, and there was an influx of worshiping these images. Does that make sense? All right. Now, the more that you study, the more that I study, I won't make an assumption for you guys, but the more that I study the way that the church developed through that period of Constantine and developed into what we would know today as being like the Roman Catholic Church, the more respect I have for the Roman Catholic Church, and also the more disgust I have for some practices. Because an amazing thing is that somehow they stayed true to the person of who Jesus is. In the face of so much opposition, in the face of so many things coming against it, and yet even to this day, you look at who do they believe that Jesus is, and it's pretty true to what we believe, To think that it survived some of these amazing attacks, but it also shows that there was a remnant that God preserved through even the worst things. And one of those, so after Constantine takes power and moves his capital, there was a council that was convened to address. I said I would talk about Arius again and Arianism. And so the first council of Nicaea was convened by Constantine upon the recommendations of church leaders. And they called all the church leaders throughout the empire, and a few hundred showed up, but they were allowed to bring others too with them, like delegates and disciples and deacons. So a couple thousand people showed up for this council. And arguments were made over who the person of Jesus was. And it looked like the Arians were gaining the day. So people that believed that Jesus was not actually God. And so it looks like it came close to where the decision went the other way. And then a guy from Egypt, Athanasius, he showed up and he gave such an eloquent speech. And then he finished it by showing the wounds that he had received by the name of Jesus Christ. And he had an animal skin and he took it off and he showed his scars. And he so overwhelmed the crowd that they affirmed the doctrine of the deity of Christ. Amazing thing, huh? And they developed what's called the Nicene Creed, which deals with who the person of Jesus was. Now, a lot of times these creeds in that day were used not so much as a thing like you're praying to God or something and trying to get favor from him, but they were a way to figure out if someone else was a real Christian or not. So by this time you got people that are saying they're Christian, and it's like today, you ask someone they're a Christian, A lot of people say yes, right? You guys ever do street evangelism? Yeah? When you're out there asking people, if you ask someone like if they're a Christian, most people say yeah, right? But then you go deeper and what do you find out? They're not, right? Well, that's pretty much the way it was then. And they might believe a bunch of different things, right? And so these creeds were ways to know if someone believed the essentials of the faith. And so often the church would when they would recite them, they would stand up in church and they would face each other and they would declare these creeds so that they're acknowledging and they're giving testimony one to another, I believe these things. That's kind of cool, isn't it? So that's some of the practices of the early church. And we're about out of time. We got 5 minutes maybe for questions and stuff. And got any questions?
So how do you got one person missing, that took out the animal skin, got the wounds?
Oh, he was beat. He was whipped by authorities because he was a Christian. He had survived the Diocletian persecutions. Diocletian was an emperor of Rome until I think like 285 AD. And so he had survived through that, and the Council of Nicaea was like 325. So Athanasius by then was an old man, but he had survived those persecutions.
What's the worst persecution in history for Christians?
Today. There's more Christians that are martyred at this time than ever in the history of the church. For the last, as far as I've been keeping track, typically there's about 250,000 to 300,000 Christians that die every year for their faith. And in the first century church, there weren't that many Christians. So more Christians die every year now for their faith than there even were Christians in the first century.
What about by proportion?
By proportion? I don't know. I haven't figured that one out. But you're a smart guy. Carissa.
In Hebrews 12, there was a verse that said to strip off the weight that slows us down. What do you think the most common weight is nowadays, and what would be the best way to alleviate it?
That's a very good question. I would say worldliness. Being if you look at like the parable of the sower, and you'd see that Jesus talked about that, the things that keeps us from having fruit, from growing to having all of our full potential, and it's that worldliness, right? We get all preoccupied. One of the things is we're not willing to die a social death in order to advance the gospel. Worried more about what our friends think.
Two things. The first one is, I know that there's a Catholic belief that you become so holy sometimes that you'll wake up with Jesus' wounds.
Oh yeah, the stigmata.
Yeah.
That's pretty trippy.
You think that came from the whole focus on the back of him?
You mean the self-flagellation? Yeah. Yeah, that's some of the practices that are pretty weird. Now, the people that say that they've had the stigmata claim that it appeared out of nowhere. Right? So, it's hard to put that with the self-flagellation. You guys know what self-flagellating is? He was asking about the stigmata, which are some Catholic leaders in the past have claimed that they got the wounds of Christ, that they just magically appeared on them. The question is whether it's real or not. And if it really is supernatural, is it heavenly or is it demonic? Did I answer it well enough?
Yeah.
Yeah?
The other question that I had was, you were mentioning like the whole, whatever together became over. Is there like books and Catholicism, like the Book of Wisdom? I don't know if they're all-
Yeah, the Catholic Apocrypha is all Old Testament. And the Catholic Apocrypha was all books that were not originally written in Hebrew. And so the Jewish people never accepted them at the same level as the rest of their books either. And even the Catholic Church that does accept them, they call them deuterocanon, which means a secondary canon. So they don't even put them on the same level as the rest of the 66 books. And they're all Old Testament.
Now, has the title of a pope in Catholicism always been in a hierarchy?
No, the Pope, okay, that's a quick story that I can get done just enough time. I didn't talk about it because it didn't happen before Nicaea, but it was actually in the 400s AD. There was 400s or 500s. It was Pope Leo the First. You can look up Pope Leo the First and find out when he reigned. But barbarians or Visigoths were invading Rome, and he went out, I believe it was Attila, maybe, Attila the Hun, that was about to ransack Rome. Leo, who was the bishop of Rome, he went out of the city gates and he convinced Attila to not ransack the city. And so when he came back in, everyone was yelling, Papa, Papa, which means dad, And so they're calling him father. And in other languages, it's Papa. Like in Spanish, the Pope is Papa. So it means it's like daddy. So all of Rome was calling him daddy because they knew who his daddy was now, who their daddy was. Because he had basically saved the city. And so he was the first one that was called Pope. The Catholic Church claims that Peter was the first Pope, but that's kind of tough. Anyone else? What's that? Peter. They claim Peter was, but that's kind of tough for them to prove. There's also there's a Pope in there that was a woman too. Yeah. There was a woman Pope in there, and I don't remember her name, but the Catholic Church tries to bury that fact a lot. But look up woman Pope on Google when you're out of here, and you'll find all of that pretty quick. Anyone else? Cool. Did you learn something? Yeah. Yeah?